Here in a moment, we're also going to read 10 verses from Genesis chapter 27. And the first thing I want us to notice as we begin studying the life of Jacob is that Jacob came from a pretty messed up home. Jacob came from a home that was divided from the very beginning. And we have two brothers that don't really get along real well. One who's loved by the father, one who's loved by mom. We've got parents that are divided, and we're going to see that in a little bit once we get to chapter 27. And I want to ask the question, who is this family? Is this God's people that we're talking about? Is Jacob really God's man? Is this really the same family that's telling us we need to trust God and we need to believe God? The answer is yes. Jacob is the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham. These are the founders of the faith. Jacob would eventually go on to be the one-day father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jacob's boys will be the boys who grow up to be the 12 tribes of Israel. And yet, our introduction to Jacob is a brother that would try to steal the birthright from his twin brother for a bowl of soup. It's amazing. And we also see that Esau was such a just kind of a wild man. Moron's the word that comes to my mind. That he would give up his birthright because he was exhausted. See, the birthright was a much bigger deal then than it is now. The firstborn got the largest portion of the inheritance. It was sort of his job when dad passed to take on the role as the head of the family. And so there was blessing that came with that. There was favor that came with that. There was resources that came with that. There was land that came with that. There was wealth that came with that. It was a big deal to be the firstborn. And so Esau comes in and he's hungry, famished. He just asked for a bowl of soup, and Jacob says, here's my shot. Swear to me that you'll give me the right to the birthright. And Esau's thought is, well, I'm pretty hungry. I feel like I'm about to die anyway. So, it's almost a joke. It's like, what good's a birthright going to do to me if I die soon? And Jacob says, no, I'm not joking. Swear to me. Give me your word that I get your birthright. And so we see this family of connivers, this family of people that are very selfish, this family of people that don't really care about each other like they should. It is a family of dysfunction. Do not let dysfunction in the family cause you to automatically assume that God can't or God won't work through people such as these. However, we're going to learn that there is a price to be paid when we live in dysfunction. That dysfunctional families are dangerous. The dysfunction in the home has consequences. Sometimes, as we're going to see, awful consequences. Now, dysfunction is not the same as non-function. Non-function means it's not working, it's broken. Dysfunction means that somehow, some way, it's still functioning. It's just not good for anybody. It's not healthy for anybody. We're surviving, but we're not thriving as a family. And we see that so often marriages are marriages that continue in dysfunction. We've got a cry room if he keeps that up. That's what it's there for. Dysfunction is not the same as non-function, but it's not good. Dysfunction is not good for anyone, and it can be dangerous. As we will see, dysfunction in the home can have a lifelong impact upon the children that are raised in that type of an environment. We've got to be able to identify it, and we've got to be able to stop it. This morning, as we start this sermon series, we're going to look at 4 characteristics of a dysfunctional home. The first thing that we see in our text is quite simply favoritism. Look at Genesis 25 and verse 28. Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. This is an awful verse. Could you imagine this being written about your home? Mom and Dad, could you imagine if this was written about you? Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. This week, studying for this particular sermon, I did a lot. I probably thought more about that verse than any of them. It's a mind-blowing verse to me. It's horrible. Mom and Dad are both guilty. It doesn't say that Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved them both the same. We see that Isaac did not love his son Jacob as much as he did Esau. And we see that Rebekah did not love Esau as much as she did Jacob. It's horrible. It's just wild. And again, I want to say, we're talking about God's people. We're talking about people that God chose to start Israel. The woundedness that comes from parents who play favorites cannot be expressed in human words. The wounds go deep. When a child is raised in a home where they feel unloved and they feel like mom doesn't love them or dad doesn't love them, there's the constant feeling of maybe it's my fault. No doubt Jacob grew up feeling like there was something wrong with him because his father did not love him like his father loved his brother. Now here's what we know. We know that's not true. We know there wasn't something wrong with Jacob, and that's why his dad didn't love him so much. We know different. We know that Isaac was just messed up, and in this area of being a father, he failed. But try to tell that to a 3 or 4-year-old boy who starts to recognize that dad loves the brother more. And it begins to mess people up at a very young age when they have parents that do not love them right. And this is a harsh reality, but it's true. The story that we're studying this morning is not somehow limited to this particular time in history. There are children who have been raised. There are many of you probably in front of me today who have been raised in homes where you were not truly loved by a mom or a dad like you should have been. And what I want you to listen to me carefully this morning is this, that as unfortunate as that is, you need to understand it has the capacity to impact you long into adulthood. There are certain things that we do to try to cope with the pain, to try to cope with the hurt, to try to cope with the rejection, to try to cope with feeling unloved. There are things that we do to somehow get through that, and we do what we learn to survive. It ultimately ends up breeding hatred, though, and resentment towards those who do get the love. We see Esau and Jacob resent each other. And it starts to breed resentment and hatred towards other people that seem to get what I don't get. And before we know it, this dysfunction that we were raised in now becomes a part of the very way that I live my life. Can I say something? Thank God that God does not love his children that way. You know, there are a lot of people that have a difficult time with God because they had a bad father. And so their father didn't love them right. Their father was a jerk. Their father was absent. Their father abandoned them. Their father was violent. Their father was abusive. And so they have a very hard time seeing God in the right light. I think that was my beard. It's one of the benefits of having an awesome beard. It just gets in the way sometimes. My brother knows. You know, it gets in the way sometimes. But sometimes we think that God, or we have a hard time seeing God for who God really is because of the way that we were raised. And I don't know who needs to hear it this morning, but someone needs to hear it loud and clear that God is a good Father. And that God does not have favorites in his kingdom. And that God loves all of us truly equally. Thank God, God does not love his sons and daughters that way. The second thing that we see, the second characteristic of a dysfunctional home is division. It's interesting that God actually told Rebekah, in response to her prayer, he told her that the two nations in her womb would be, and this is the word God used, divided. We see this division begin early on. Before I read verses 1 through 10 of Genesis 27, I want to set the stage so that you understand what we're about to read. The story is advanced a long ways in just 2 chapters, and Isaac is about to die. He's so old that his sight has left him, and he is 100% blind. And so all that he has left is his smell, his touch, his hearing, but he has no vision at all. And one of the things that was customary in this day and time is that when it was time to settle the birthright, that when it was time to pass on the possessions, when it was time, if you will, to crown your firstborn son, the leader of the family, the father would put his hand on the son and he would bless the son, he would pray over the son, and he would speak out loud the blessings and the inheritance that he was passing on to the son. So Isaac is ready to do that. And so he calls in Esau and he lets Esau know, hey, it's time for this to happen. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to go do something. We're about to read it. He said, then I want you to come back and I'm going to give you the blessing. Rebekah overhears what's going on and says, oh, I want Jacob to have that. I don't want Esau to have that. And so Rebekah gets involved and comes up with a little conniving plan to try to steal away the blessing from Esau. Let's look what it says. Genesis 27, verses 1 through 10. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, my son. And he answered, here I am. He said, behold, I am old and I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me, so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. That verse also bothers me. It doesn't say their son, it says his son. Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son, Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son, Jacob, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau, bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 goats, 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare for them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. Jacob would talk over the plan with his mom, and he'd say, Mom, Dad's never going to buy it. I don't look anything like Esau. I don't sound like Esau. She basically says, son, don't worry about that. I've got a plan. I'm going to take the hair of those goats, and we're going to put them over you so that when your father questions whether you're really Esau, you can put your hand out, and he can touch your hand and your arm and feel that fur, and he'll think that it's Esau. And they start conniving together how to pull this thing off. Can I pause for just a moment and say that the Bible is one of the most authentic books you'll ever read? I mean, it's amazing to me. It records the wickedness of these people who would eventually become the heroes of the faith. God doesn't pull any punches. God doesn't lie to us about his people. And it's honestly it's hard to read some of this stuff. That's an awful statement that Isaac spoke to his son, Esau, and Rebekah spoke to her son, Jacob. That's just, it's raw. It's honest. It's terrible. It's wrong. It's wicked. But it's honest. And it's real. The reality is it happens. And I thank God that He's honest about it for us, and that God's Word doesn't hide from us the truth about people. It doesn't hide from us their struggles. It doesn't hide from us their sins. It doesn't hide from us their failures. It doesn't hide from us how long it took some of these people to become the men and women of God that they were supposed to be. Now back to the division. When you talk about divided, wow, we see division between the husband and the wife, division between the children. We are literally making teams in the family. That's dysfunction. When you got teams in the family working together against the others. This morning, if you're in a home that's operating at all like this, I pray that the Holy Ghost will get a hold of your heart and you will recognize this morning you have got to make some changes. You have got to stop. You cannot keep doing this to yourself, and if you have kids in the home, you cannot keep doing this to your kids. You have to stop. Stop making teams. Stop conniving against your loved ones. Stop loving someone more than another. Recognize you have got to get things fixed in your home. God desires unity. Unity. In Psalm 133 in verse 1 it says, "Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity." Now the opposite of unity is division. Division is a tactic of the enemy to destroy God's people. We've got to fight against it. In the home, in the marriage, we've got to make up our mind. We're not divided. We are not fighting against each other. We are in this battle together. And I want you to understand something about unity. I think unity, the opposite of division. Unity is an important thing to understand. Unity does not mean that we always agree about everything. That's not what unity is. If you want to get a technical term, uniformity is when everything looks the same way. Uniformity is when you take a paper and you cut it up and you pull it out and you've got a bunch of cookie cutters that are all identical. That's uniformity. We're all uniform. Unity is not that. Unity means that we're different. We think different. God created us differently. I see things a little different than you see things. Me and my wife see things a little different than each other. All of my children see things a little differently than each other. They see things differently than us. But unity does not mean we have to see everything the exact same way. Rather, we recognize we're on the same team and we ultimately want the same goals, and we're serving the same God who has a design for our home, a design for the marriage, a design for the family, a design for the church. And unity says we're willing to come together and we're willing to work together for the glory of God and the further of His kingdom. It's not always going to look exactly like I want it to look like. It's not always going to look exactly what you want it to look like. But unity is something that God calls us to. And there's a real degree of humbleness or humility that is required in a home that has unity. Sir, if you are going to foster unity in your home, and you are going to make sure there's not division in your home, you're going to have to recognize you can't be right all the time. First of all, you're not right all the time. But you can't be right all the time. You've got to find ways to humble yourself, lay down your pride, and realize, hey, we don't have to lose I don't have to win every battle. You've got to learn to stand for what's important. You've got to learn to lead in the areas of God. But there are a lot of things that we argue about and we fight about that simply we don't need to argue about and we don't need to fight about. Things that really just don't matter. And so it'd be better to say, rather than fighting about this thing that really doesn't matter, it's not this massive impact somehow on our spiritual, direction as a family. And we got to learn to humble ourselves. And ladies, you're going to have to do the same thing. You've got to learn that just because you have a strong feeling about something doesn't mean that you always get what you want. And honestly, I believe the same thing goes with parenting. And I had no plan. This isn't even in my notes. I'm off on a rabbit trail right now. But we are talking about unity in the home. And parenting is a difficult thing to talk about because honestly, I believe the way that we parent needs to change as our children get older. I think the way that you parent a 13-year-old is different from how you parent a 3-year-old. And I think the way you parent a 16-year-old is different from how you parent a 13-year-old. And so I'm not going to get into those details. I just say that to say I'm being very general in the statement I'm about to make. But here's the statement. Parents, sometimes you got to let the kids win. Just because you're mom and just because you're dad doesn't mean that your children should never have any input at all into what the family does. And sometimes being willing to listen and hear your children out and think, you know what, okay, this isn't really the direction I was thinking, but I'm going to get behind this and I'm going to support, this idea that my kids have, and we're going to work on this thing. And learning to let everybody have a role in the family. Husbands, learning to let your wives have a role in the decision making. Wives, learning to let your husbands play a role in your thought processes. And parents, learning to let children play a role in how we move forward as a family. God desires unity in the home. Number 3, the third characteristic this morning of a dysfunctional home is deceit. Deceit. So, first of all, we've got conniving. In verse 5, Rebecca's listening in around the door, and nobody knows she's listening in, and she's thinking, all right, how do I subvert the will of my husband? How do I subvert the blessing of my firstborn? How do I get what I want and make sure they don't get what they want? She's conniving, she's thinking, she's brainstorming it. And then the next level of deceit, we end up with pretending. And you find that in verses 12 through 19 when her and Jacob are talking this out. And Jacob's like, Dad's going to know. She's like, no, don't worry about that, my son. I've got it figured out. I know how your brother cooks, and I can cook just like him. I know how your brother looks, and I can take care of that too. We'll take the meat that we're going to make, and we'll just take the skin and the fur from the animals, and we'll put it on you temporarily. The only issue is going to be your voice. But everything else, we can make you look like Esau. And now we literally have people pretending to be someone they're not, to get something that, quite frankly, wasn't theirs to choose whether or not they got it or not. And it ultimately leads to, and this is a staple of dysfunctional homes, it ultimately leads to just outright lying to each other. I mean, outright lying to each other. When all of a sudden the plan is enacted and everything's gone wrong and it's too late and there's no turning back and you just have some of the most outright crazy lies. Let's look at it together, some of the lying in Genesis 27. So what I'm about to begin in verse 18, Jacob has put on the skin of the goats. He's put on his costume, if you will. His mother's made the soup, and Jacob's ready to come in and try to trick his own dad, his blind dad, into thinking that he's Esau. So we pick up in verse 18. So he went into his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me." But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" Pause there for a moment. So, Rebekah and Jacob knew they had to move pretty quickly. We're already told that Esau was a very skilled hunter. And so as soon as Esau leaves the house, Rebekah's like, "Jacob, we don't have much time. We've got to do this." They have their quick little argument about how this is never going to work. She convinces him, "You've got to do it. You got to do it now. Go get the goats, bring them in." And so it's like this real quick thing that happens. And all of a sudden, Jacob comes into his blind dad, and his dad's like, "Whoa, that was fast. You already went out and hunted and came back?" I mean, even his dad's thinking, this is a little fast. Look at his answer. He answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Dang. That's getting evil now. I mean, you talk about manipulating. You talk about doing whatever you can to get what you want. Now you're going to bring God into the equation, and you're going to say that this is happening because God gave you success. Verse 21, "Then Isaac said to Jacob, 'Please come near, that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not.' So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, who felt him and said, 'The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are like Esau.' And he did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. He said, 'Are you really my son, Esau?' He answered, 'I am.'" Talk about deceit. Outright lying. Isaac says, "I hear you with what's coming out of your mouth, but it doesn't line up with your hands." And that's the reality, is that most of the time your mouth will tell on you. You can do all that you want to do. You can show up, put your hands to work, dress the part, wear the costume, wave the Christian flag, but your mouth will tell on you. The Bible teaches us that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. This is an important lesson. You talking about things you shouldn't be talking about, making crude jokes you shouldn't be making crude jokes with, cussing like a sailor in your daily life, cursing with your mouth, just talking about things you shouldn't be talking about. You need to understand something. Something's wrong with your heart. I'm not going to stand up here and say you are a complete fraud and you are not saved, but here's what I will say. Something is wrong with your heart, because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and eventually your mouth will tell on you. And you need to trust God's word with that. Rather than being angry about what I just said, you should be thankful that God has actually given us a little bit of insight into how to tell where our hearts are. Look what comes out of your mouth. What are the things you like to talk about? Do you like to talk about God? Do you like to talk about the things of God? Do you like to bless God with your mouth? Do you like to praise Him when you have the opportunity? Or are you constantly speaking negativity? Constantly speaking about all that's wrong in your world and all that's wrong in our world, and constantly letting pessimistic things come out of your mouth? Your mouth will tell on you. And it's an important thing to understand that it's one of the ways to tell what's really going on in this heart of yours. Thank God for it. Thank God that God gives us a few ways that we can kind of look ourselves in the mirror and realize, hey, there's some things that still need to change in this life of mine. And before I make you mad this morning, I want to say what I said again. Hey, It took years and years and years for these men and women of faith that we're reading about to become the great men and women of God they eventually became. All right? And so don't get mad. I'm talking to me, and when I'm talking to you this morning, when I point a finger out in the crowd, there's 3 more coming right back at me. But we need to be honest that there's a problem when what we do with our hands and our feet doesn't line up with our mouth. We see all-out deceit here. We see lying. One of the final things that we see, and it's just really throughout all of the story, the 4th characteristic of dysfunction in a home is confusion. It's just confusion. I mean, we're looking at it here. It's confusion. Isaac's like, hey, well, I mean, this doesn't seem like my son. And I am not sure. He asks him a couple times, are you my son? And everything's messed up. Deep inside, he knows something's wrong. He can't verify it with his eyes. But all of his other senses, his smell, he smells the game, he smells the stew, his touch, the hair on the arms of his son. And he's confused. And you'll find that in a dysfunctional home, confusion is something that constantly is part of the story. It's like there's no real understanding of each other. Both parties in a dysfunctional marriage look at each other, and the husband thinks, I don't know what's wrong with her. I don't know how she thinks like she thinks. I don't know why she does what she does. I don't understand her at all. And she doesn't understand me at all. And the wife turns around and she says, I don't understand that man. I don't know how he thinks what he thinks. I don't know how he does what he does. I don't understand him at all. He doesn't understand me at all. And there's this real confusion because nobody has any understanding of each other. There is almost always no understanding of why things won't change. Why is it always like this? And so a lot of people end up just feeling hopeless and giving up because they don't know why. They don't know why we always fight. We don't know why we can't get along. I don't know why it's always dysfunction in the home, why there's always teams, why there's always division, why there's lying. No understanding of how to change. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to start to look at how God absolutely transforms Jacob's life. But I got to be honest with you. Next week's not a whole lot better either. But it's amazing to me that God would just show us how hard it was for Jacob to eventually get to the place that he's wrestling with God. There comes a moment in Jacob's life when God says, you're not even Jacob anymore. You are Israel. I'm changing your name. I've changed who you are. I've changed your destiny, and you will not even be called by the same name anymore. That's where this story's headed. Man, there's a lot that had to happen to get there. And so what I want to do, I want to encourage those of you, if you are here this morning and you're in any way, your family might not be this messed up, but if any way there's some stuff that's like resonating with you, like, well, that particular point, yes, okay, that we've got a problem with this going on in our home or in our marriage, or you might be somebody that was raised in this type of family, and you're concerned that it's still impacting the family you have now. I want to encourage you to do 2 things. Number 1, I want to encourage you to stay with us through this sermon series. I might close it up in 3 weeks. I don't see it taking more than 4. So this isn't going to take months. This isn't going to take 2 or 3 months of your life. We're talking 3 or 4 weeks. And so I want to encourage you, stay with us through this sermon series and give us some time to develop. And the second thing I want to do is this. I want to challenge you to just be willing to ask God to help you be delivered out of this dysfunctional living through this sermon series. I want you to pray about that. I want you to say, God, You know it and I know it. This thing kind of pricked my heart this morning. And if there is an answer, if there is a solution out of this, I want to know, and I want you to show me, and God, I'm willing to do my part. Right? You can't do anything else for anyone else. You can't make a decision for your spouse or your kids or your mom or your dad. You can't make a decision for your husband. You can't make a decision for your wife, but you can make a decision for you. And I want you to be honest with God and say, God, I'm willing to let whatever you need to do in my life to help my family progress beyond this over the next few weeks. If, Lord, you'll speak to me, show me, reveal it to me. And then I want you to have an expectation that the God who hears your prayers is going to answer your prayer. He's going to give you some answers that you've been looking for. I want to conclude this morning with this. This sermon series does lead to hope. But the life of Jacob is big enough that I can't really start and finish in the exact same sermon with the hope that I want to get to. I just want you to know this sermon series leads with great hope. It finishes with great hope. The one thing I want to say in conclusion is that the heart of the problem, how did this family get here? What is the root of the problem? It's not trusting God. Now, what do I mean by that? These people didn't trust God that God was going to take care of what God needed to take care of. Rather than, and they didn't trust God with God's timing. You remember what God told Rebekah in the very beginning? Here's what God said: the older will serve the younger. But Rebekah, instead of trusting God with that, instead of sitting down and having a peace about it and saying, God, I don't know how you're going to do this, but you said, God, and I'm not going to get in the way, but God, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to trust in your word. Rebekah said, well, doesn't look like God's going to do what God said he's going to do, so I've got a plan instead. Jacob, get in here. We're going to lie to your dad. The heart of dysfunction is when we don't trust God and we become impatient and we're afraid that God's not going to do what we think he needs to do. And so we decide we're going to take the role of God and we're going to start manipulating the situation and we're going to do whatever we have to do to get the results we want to get. That's what I mean when I say the heart of it is simply not trusting God. It's just not being patient. Rather than praying about it, putting things in God's hands and sitting back and letting God do what only God can, we start to get impatient. This is the heart. It's the root of dysfunction. And ultimately it leads to hurt, it leads to pain, it leads to things getting worse. Consider all the collateral damage that happens to get what we want. Yet, this is mind-blowing to me, yet, this was God's chosen family to bring the nation of Israel through. Man, what hope does that give us when our families don't look like we want it to, our marriages aren't working exactly like we want them to, conflict in the home, conflict with kids. What hope does that give us to know, guys, this right here, this is the story of where the nation of Israel started. Because God is able to take our broken messes. God is able to take our broken homes. God is able to take our broken lives. God is able to take our broken childhoods. God is able to take our pain and our brokenness. And he's able to heal us from it. He's able to teach us through it. He's able to lead us out of it. And he's able to make us and mold us into different men and women of God that he designed us to be.